It's great to be here. In 2004, I founded the Sense Lab. What I was looking for was to create an environment that brought people from the community and people from the university together at the intersection of art and philosophy toward a reimagining of what a politics to come might be. I think of the Sense Lab as a laboratory for thought in the act.
Erin, her activities are as an artist and as a philosopher, so she starts as a kind of hybrid animal. I come out of philosophy, and I always thought that philosophy should be an experimental practice. And the question was always in my mind, if philosophy lived up to its potential as an experimental practice, what would it be like? And the Sense Lab has taught me what that can look like. But when I was thinking that philosophy could be or should be experimental, I didn't ever mean it that philosophy wasn't already doing something. I felt very strongly that the act of thinking itself was a form of doing. I felt that even though I was yearning to leave the desk and to bring the philosophy, let it bleed off the page, that in a sense it was always already doing that it was following me around every day, that it was inflecting the way I was looking at things, the way I was meeting people. It was making different tendencies in me come out, making me observe things differently. So that philosophy was a kind of wayfinding or a pathfinding that was indicating paths of potential not yet traveled. And if there's a way of bringing that further in an experimental context, that it could only revivify the philosophy itself. And on the other hand, I knew that art was already a kind of pathfinding in the making, and that it was full of thoughts that weren't necessarily yet couched in language, but actions, doings that were pointing us toward new ways of seeing and new ways of feeling. So people talk a lot about theory and practice and how it's either necessary to lop off one or the other or bring them back together again. But behind the Sense Lab and that kind of activities that we engage in is the idea that you don't have to bring them back together because they're already moving toward each other, with philosophy a kind of doing thinking and art a kind of thinking in the doing, so that this laboratory I was looking for would be a kind of context for thought in the act. And I just wanted to mention that the images we'll be passing by without commentary are from some of the collective art projects that were improvised during the events we'll talk about, as well as some of the art intervention projects that came out of them, mixed in with some of the fabric work that was mentioned earlier from Erin's own work.
So the context in Montreal that the Sense Lab came out of is a context that I suspect a lot of you are familiar with. In Canada, we call it research creation. In the US and Australia, sometimes it goes by art-based research. Research creation, though, had an interesting history, because in 2002, roughly speaking, it became a grant agency category, which meant that it immediately connected to cultural capital. And the question that we felt urgency about at the Sense Lab was, how could we take back this hyphen between research and creation in a way that didn't allow research creation to subsume under this theory practice umbrella that Brian was talking about, where what you get is a kind of social science methodology imposed on the artistic process, rather than believing that the artistic process has its own thinking that is part of it. The other thing we were concerned about was the ways in which Montreal itself was using artistic value toward market value, the way that research creation was tending to be taken over by local community, particularly in relation to tourism. So what we did in the very beginning was to ask ourselves, how can we get people to come together, to come to Montreal, to join us in a practice that challenges this hyphen between research and creation, that challenges the thinking and the doing and the doing and the thinking. How can we do this in a way that they don't habitually come together? And we thought, well, the way they habitually come together is through their products. They come together through their artworks, or they come together, or we come together through our papers, our finished work. And so we sent out an initial call for the first event of the series, which was called Technologies of Lived Abstraction. And the call we sent out asked people to tell us why they needed an environment that didn't connect at the level of products, but connected instead at the level of process.
And for what was going on to be a thinking in the act, the relationship between the different practices would have to alter a bit. The art could never be looked on as illustrating a concept, but always enacting concepts actively. The philosophy could never be looked on as commenting upon, or certainly not judging the art. They had to connect, as Erin just said, at the level of their processes, the levels at which both were pointing to potentials that were not yet fully unfolded in the world, and that could be followed perhaps further as part of a potential politics. So if we're talking about something in the act and bringing things together differently, what we're talking about is a practice for making events, for generating events and generating them differently.
So the first question we had was a question of conditions. We knew that it wasn't enough to get a whole bunch of really amazing people in one space. It wasn't enough to create an event, because an event has to do more than follow its program. It has to create the stakes of its own adventure. And so the first thing we did was to begin to think in terms of a vocabulary of techniques. What kinds of techniques would be necessary for the initial crossing into the threshold? What kinds of conditions would be necessary to facilitate not only the moving from art to philosophy and back toward a potential politics, but also from small groups to large groups, from collective organization to the potential of new forms of collaboration coming on after the event.
What we wanted to work on were techniques, but if we're talking about crossing a threshold into a creative or improvisational event together, the techniques had to be of a particular kind. They had to be what we called techniques of relation. Techniques aren't only about objects, they're not only about functions, they're not only about systems, they're also about the ways we come together. So one of the ideas behind most of the activities at the Sense Lab is that there is a whole domain of activity and domain of active research in techniques of relation, how to bring people together, coming across that threshold into an experimental practice.
We had to learn often the hard way, and failure is one of our best techniques, it turns out. I'll give you an example early on. Our first event was called Dancing the Virtual, and for each of the events, we begin a year in advance. We send out a list of readings. We meet on Skype every 2 weeks. We have online collaborative tools for discussion. And we work really hard so that we can generate a vocabulary together that can work across a community with very different practices. But at the first event, after we had I think a very successful first half day, we moved into the philosophical discussion of the work of Alfred North Whitehead, and everything collapsed. We had suddenly 3 people talking and everybody else looking cowed, you know, that usual look, glazy-eyed look people get when they have philosophy in front of them. And so we had this failure. And we immediately went to hide in a tent. For each of our events, we make a sleeping place or a hiding place or a withdrawing place. So we went and hid in the tent. We asked the people who followed us there, what do you think we can do? And the first very strong technique that the Sense Lab came up with, that we've used all along, and I think has now been taken over by many people, I can't lay claim to it, it wasn't my technique, we call conceptual speed dating.
And conceptual speed dating was especially exciting for me because philosophy can often be a very solitary activity. But what conceptual speed dating does is sort of stage a kind of collective thinking, and the idea, like speed dating, is that you have very quick conversations, exactly timed, 5 minutes. If you're in the middle of of a word even. You have to stop when the bell rings. And it's organized around a question from a text. We do a lot of really close concept work that we then move into sort of an active, creative, hands-on work. And it's usually a concept that's very small, maybe that passed unnoticed, but once you start noticing it, it's like part of the warp in the woof that holds the entire text together. And you're starting to discover something together, but for the first few conversations, you maybe never even noticed it was there and didn't know where to find it in the text. And then you find yourself scurrying and then going to the next person, and what happened with the person before is sort of echoing in your brain, so you don't know quite if you thought it or the person before you did, and you forward it on to the next. And sort of like a game of telephone, this concept starts to build and change, and by the end, everyone has had 10, 15 conversations, and there's a kind of buzz in the room. They've all probably thought it a bit differently, but they've differently together been through that process. And then you can go to a large group and have an extremely productive discussion because the room is always already buzzing with a collective thinking.
So we want to quickly give you 3 examples of techniques that came out of our third event called Society of Molecules. By the time we got to our third event, we had a really interesting problem, and that was that everybody who had come to our first event had decided to come to our second event, and then they wanted to come to the third event, so we couldn't welcome any new people. And so what we decided to do was to hold the event in a distributed way across as many countries, as many locations as people wanted. So we suggested to people that they create a molecule. A molecule could be 3 to 10 people, and each of those molecules we asked them to come up with a local aesthetico-political intervention. And the intervention could be anything they wanted, but would have to connect in some way to their everyday lives. And then the question for us was, how do we create a technique, this technique of the threshold, this technique of small group to large group, that would work, as it turned out, across 17 cities and 15 countries?
We're actually talking in some ways about constraining the interaction. We have an overall concept for the techniques, which we call enabling constraints. But we use it with a very different idea of what a constraint is. It's not something that boxes an interaction in. It's not something that frames it. It's more like a springboard or a trampoline that you go from. So you think of these techniques of relation like the emissary as doing that. The idea was the emissary was that we had a distributed event, like Erin said, happening in 17 different countries. We didn't want to just share information and have it all on an informational level. We wanted there to be an intensity and even an affective contagion. So we decided that each molecule would send an emissary to another molecule, a host molecule. And when that emissary arrived at the host molecule, the person who they make contact with would have to draw that group together to create what we called a relational soup. And there was a particular technique for making that first contact.
So what we asked people to do, me as a central pivot, what I asked people to do from each molecule was to send me a movement profile. So a little bit of terrorist politics here, but toward an activist politics. And the movement profile had to outline how you moved. So if you were the host, you had to tell us where you were in the morning, where you had coffee, where you dropped your kids off, where you went to teach, where you went to school, etc. Because the emissary could come anytime in 5 months preceding the event, which took place from May 1st to 7th, 2009. The thing is, though, that if you were the host and you left, somebody else had to move in your movements. So for 5 months, those movements were choreographed in a way that the emissary could find you. And when the emissary did find you, what you had to do was you had 24 hours to bring your whole molecule together to make this relational soup with your molecule, after which you had to produce a recipe that the emissary could take back to their local molecule, and they left a seed behind. So this was in the hope of creating an affective contagion, so that what you were getting was not the information necessarily of the local molecule, but a seed of its process.
So the interventions of the molecules were all completely different, and they were done without being networked in live, so they were pretty much on their own. So what we tried to do is set conditions going in and out of the common week of activities that would already have that kind of affective resonance in play. The relational soup was a way of giving another molecule a taste of the process and of the stakes in the project of a faraway molecule. The process seed was something that had to be tended or cared for by the people who received it, and that gave something that was a collective follow-on from the event. So there was fore tracings and after tracings of the event through these techniques.
Just a few examples of techniques. The San Diego-Tijuana molecule took a payphone on the Mexican side of the border and transformed it into a Skype phone. There were also a couple of Montreal molecules, and one of them made a lack of information booth.
Yeah, we were interested in the derelict spaces in the city, and we started inhabiting them and seeing how they were inhabited, who used them, what kinds of patterns of life that were unrecognized and unofficial were happening in them. And then we decided that it might make sense to have a lack of information booth to transmit the disconnect between the city decision makers in charge of the city redevelopment and the forms of life that were sort of improvising themselves live in the wild.
So now we introduce you to this concept which has framed everything we've said today, which is the idea of a pragmatics of the useless. We've described for you lots of action, and you might be wondering why we want to call it a pragmatics of the useless. And the reason for that is that we believe that what we try to do at the Sense Lab, and we should say here that the Sense Lab connects to other communities, other activist communities. We don't see ourselves as doing work that isn't already being done elsewhere, but rather vectoring into it. But what we try to get away from is the idea of added value that is so central to capitalism. What we try to get to instead is the idea that you create your own value, and not under modes of evaluation already existent, but in movements that invent what it means to create a politics to come or an alter economy.
So that what we're talking about is a process that just exists for itself, not toward particular products at the end, and wants to spin itself out to inspire other actions elsewhere along the same lines. So we don't think of the Sense Lab as being an institution. We don't think of it as being a collective identity. We don't think of it even as being a model. We pass through a very large number of names on the screen of people who have passed through our lives through these projects, and we see it as a group effort that is taking up forms of action that exist in many places.
For a politics to come. Thank you.